right. So after doing this article on Hedy Lamarr and thinking through this whole notion of, the bioplasmatic connection between archaeometry and how the POR/DOR spectrum of energy can actually, play into the manifestation of inventions and things like that, it got me thinking more about magnetic tape and the materials that are used in them, and how magnetic tape came into being, because again, it operates. Getting back to the concept of the spiral, it operates on a concept of rotating reels going across a tape head. And so I started thinking about, since that acts as a memory, as a sorts, what are the materials that are involved with that? Because I never really thought about it much until recently. And as I started looking into that, early magnetic recording, they say began around the 1920s. It was something that was more of a German innovation. So naturally, around that time, you can see that the Nazis were probably innovating it most and probably had the earliest access to it even before the Americans did during pre-World War II and into World War II. They had a lot of advancements in the radio communication as well as magnetic tape recording. So there's a definite correlation between these things, especially as it relates to broadcast industry, but we'll talk about that later. But audio recording didn't really gain widespread acceptance in the U.S. until the 50s. So I started thinking about, what are the materials that are used inside tape, and how does that relate to like human DNA? Like, are there common materials? Because think about it as a binding material for memory, and then how does that translate to Earth materials as well, right? Because obviously, whatever you're going to get to put into magnetic tape is going to be an Earth material, right? So I started thinking about how that might, connect to different etheric osmosis processes between whatever the layers are within the human blood layer and whatever might be inside the metallic layers that binds magnetic tape. And so when I looked that up, it said that it was iron oxide and chromium that are most used, but specifically iron oxide seems to be the most common material, with chromium being more of a later innovation. And then I started looking up, what are the other things that iron oxide work with, and I guess it's a common thing involving plant growth and soils, as a oxidation layer, and also it's involved with the human iron oxide, the human hemoglobin process in the DNA levels involves iron. So now we have a common material here with iron oxide, and how that binds potentially between the human DNA, magnetic tape, and the earth materials that magnetic tape is made from, because even if it's an artificial invention, it still comes from organic materials, and that's something we always have to remember. you know so it's funny, actually. I just thought of this, but Robert Anton Wilson said there's no such thing as inorganic invention, because even if it's artificial, it has to originate with organic materials. So I always thought that's an interesting thing to observe. But how does that relate, though, once we get to that, and we're thinking more in terms of, hemoglobin as a communication or a binding layer, how does that relate to different blood groups, because they say, like, people with Rh negative have, like this, maybe potentially more psi-ability, or the ability to maybe transmit and receive data at larger footprints or larger spheres of influence, as it were. And I think there might be something to that. I just haven't really, I don't have a lot of the medical background or a deep knowledge of blood groups and things like that through which to really understand these things more intrinsically. It's just more of an intuitive thing that I've observed through people, and, observations from reading and hearing things and things like that. So I just started thinking about, this gets back to the Showtime series Homeland, and the character Carrie Matheson, played by Claire Danes, who she's an investigator in the CIA and a field agent. And, she has this, well, they call it an episode on the show, but I think it was more that she was just heavily tapped into an intuitive communication pattern, where she jumps out of a car of her sister's and she runs to the park, and she's really into this, what she's learning about this case, to where she's almost, she can't stop investigating. She's really into it. But she jumps on the ground and she starts feeling the earth, and she says, I can't remember the exact line was, but she says, like, this is how it works, there's roots, and these plants all go into the earth, and those roots go to other roots, and they go to the trees, and this is how it works. And I really understand what that means now, because I think that potentially connects to the iron oxide levels in soil. I mean, really, let's think about this less as a esoteric or a new age concept and more about a science. There's iron oxide levels in the soil. You have iron oxide in your blood, and then once you start drilling down to what that looks like, you get into the hemoglobin layers. That the iron oxide looks like these spiraled coils, right, within your DNA. And so, since there's been a lot of talk about how those spiral coils are like communication layers, then it kind of makes sense why that, people sense things, right? That you have a sense of the weather, you have a sense for like things of that nature. It kind of makes sense because when you really get down to it, you're tapping into one of the earliest forms of internet. You're by touching the soil, you're tying into a root that's like plugging into a LAN port, and now that LAN port has access to all these routers and network nodes, and then they can access other network nodes, and those are the trees roots, because the trees tend to have deeper roots that spread farther, right? So you think about that in terms of how it works in communication networks. These were the early communicators, and so if you really think about what blood represents and different blood groups represent, it could just be that some people have always had, since birth, a stronger communication connection to the earth via the iron oxide content in tandem with things like copper potentially, because that's a conductor. A lot of these things could potentially be playing into why some people have intuitive ability, and in tandem why they might also be selected sometimes without their permission or knowledge for testing, in environments where maybe these things are being done to them or extracted from them without their permission. So I think it's a debate that's worth having, because let's getting back to it. Who was able to use this tape, the magnetic tape, the earliest, and I think that we have to start studying that. Who were the earliest users of videotape? Who were the earliest users of magnetic tape that recorded audio, reel-to-reel technology, cassette tapes? And, who recorded their voice onto those tapes, and, where are those tapes today? Are they still lasting? What types of materials are on them? How does that bind to us as humans? If we left iron oxide from the resonation to the frequency of our voice onto that tape, it still exists at that etheric level if you really think about it. It's still kind of communicating and resonating in a way. And maybe if you were even to study magnetic tape and place it into the Carillion photography, you could maybe learn something, assuming it wouldn't erase it in the process. I don't know how that would work, but it might be worth investigating. To see if a tape might have a life force to it via that iron oxide content and the bioplasma potentially connected to it. And these are the type of tests that I'm interested in doing. Just so you know, I think these are things that are very worth doing. But when you think about the DNA as kind of a spiraled coil that broadcasts like an antenna, and it's more of like a pumping or a pulsing spiral as opposed to a waveform, this may be why, that POR, positive orgone, and deadly orgone radiation spectrums are so misunderstood. It's difficult to quantify because there's more of a randomness. I think it feeds into the spiral, the golden ratio, more so and more randomness than other forms of technology and communication layers. And that might be why it's less predictable, therefore less controllable. Like, you're not going to ever really get down to the key of this because it's infinite. It's always existed and will continue to exist when you get down to it, right? So all anybody can ever do is find the numeric patterns that are within that spiral and tap into it. And so when you think about what magnetic tape is really doing, because it's all involving a spiral, not a single one of these technologies doesn't involve them going around in a circle. All it's doing is just basically tapping into the mathematic patterns, and it's sort of mimicking a process that we communicate with potentially with our iron oxide levels and hemoglobin between human beings, and how that connects down to the earth, and that a lot of our communication layers may be less above us and maybe more below us. Like, the arches of your feet connect to the grass, and then there's a communication layer that you're automatically tapping into via the roots and into the trees. It's something to think about. And so getting into more specifics about how does that play into DNA as a read-write mechanism, right? So if it's magnetic tape and you can read-write to it, how does this translate to bioplasma being transferred potentially from the recording of these activities onto videotape? Meaning, as actors and actresses potentially are acting in a movie, for example, or maybe people are just recording, home movies or whatever and everything like that, and they're experiencing a range of emotions while this is all happening. How does that translate to that bioplasma, the iron oxide and their levels being transferred over to that magnetic tape, you see? Because in a way, it's sort of like a copy and an imprint of everything that's occurring within the surroundings, the resonation of your voice, or the visual image of your 3D self, right, as it appears on screen. So really, when you're thinking about this, it's sort of like that iron oxide is just taking this sort of DNA imprint of a space-time in addition to like those spiraled coils in tandem, because it's involving this complex series of magnetic resonance and a little bit of electromagnetic interactions there too via the technology being delivered over electricity. See, so I think that you're dealing with something that's pretty esoteric, but really when you get down to it, it's sort of a mimicking of a human process like we find with other technologies. So I'm just thinking about how this translates to why we've had these cultural shifts, thinking more sociologically, why, our culture's turned a little bit dark. There's more films that seem to revolve around trauma, torture, human sacrifice, or what we call in this country ritual murder. It seems like there seems to be a normalization of cannibalism and vampirism in television shows and in Hollywood. There's more singers that are talking about it. There's more people saying that they openly practice cannibalism. There's things called the Cannibal Club and things like that. So I'm wondering, what is driving this culture, because it seems to be something that I think has been hidden underneath for a very long time, but is just now sort of being brought out into the open. And I think it specifically involves what people at a more esoteric level must have understood for a very long time about the way your blood at a DNA level has certain metals or iron oxides or whatever that's inside your hemoglobin. Chromium, for example, is another form that can interact. And so what happens when blood spills into the soil is really that you're having materials that are common to the earth that are returning to the earth. And then over time, it starts to interact with the iron oxide iron oxide levels in the soil. And as it goes down further into the earth, then you have crystal concentrations. And so thinking it through, you really are seeing that, crystals and crystal concentrations, crystal caves, really are sort of like a storage media for everything, because it's effectively everything that's been translated from the human experience and all the other forms of human life and other plant life, all condensed within these collections of crystalline formations that involve all these materials, And oftentimes it'll have mixtures of some of these magnetic materials that make it more luminescent too at the same time. So thinking through about how this correlates to the extraction of ether, I think we can talk about that another time. Like, are there more subtle ways of extracting these types of energies, not just like blood, for cannibalism and things like that, but more as an etheric, orgone, like bottled orgone, that can be used either to traumatize people or for bioenergetic weapons, or potentially as like a healing elixir, because you have to think that there's mechanisms through which to do this. And if you've been following my research, I'm going to expand on that a little bit more, because I have some theories on how it's happening, but I don't want to get into that right now. So how does that communicate, or how does that correlate to crystal communication? Because, if you think about it, a lot of our technologies are using crystals, right? So, we're really, sometimes they're synthetic crystals, but what really is anything synthetic if it's always made from organic materials? Once you form a crystal, whether it's mimicked or through the organic process, I think it just really depends. And then you have a series of processors that are out there using a common crystal that are oscillating at the same frequency. It's really kind of doing something similar to the way that people more intuitively communicate at a psychic level or an intuitive level, or receive information from trees and roots, which really, when you think about it, is your hemoglobin has spiraling coils, and it's interacting with iron oxide levels at a similar level and various other metals inside your bloodstream that are in the soil. They can sort of travel through pulses, maybe through the arches of your feet or something. Again, this is a lot of hypothesis here, but that it's exploiting that existing communication network of trees and roots and plants and roots and things like that to talk to other people. And then, what got me thinking more in terms of this involving the whole sacrifice culture was the film Zardoz, because it involves this, plot line surrounding these groups of people that are separated in these zones called brutals and exterminators. And the brutals are just there to basically be exploited and killed by the exterminators. And the exterminators are taught by their god Zardoz to hate all life and to basically just exterminate everything they see, and to ensure that no new life is created. They are taught to hate reproduction. So I thought that was an interesting plot line. It has Sean Connery in it, and I don't want to give away the plot or anything like that, but throughout the entire movie there's constant communication with crystals and asking crystals questions, and the crystals are speaking back and telling them that they function as a bit of a god brain and things like that. So I don't know, as a matter of research, it might just be worth seeing, but I don't like to tell anybody to watch something that's like that or anything like that, so I'll leave it up to you. But as research, you might want to look into it. But a lot of interesting things about crystal communication in it. And I thought about how that might relate to the playback of memory, right? So when you have a memory in your mind and you're thinking about it and you're playing it back, how does that translate to a magnetic tape going in a spiral and going in rotation and feeding across a tape head. Really think about how technology works and how it mimics human processes, and then it might make more sense why, as we've advanced these technologies and used them over and over again and fed more of these common materials into this spiral and recorded memories of our imprints into those recorded materials, how those are feeding into the spiral. It really is sort of, it's developing that spheres of life, the spheres of influence. I've discussed in my other materials. It's sort of like people who were the earliest ones who recorded their voice or their faces or likeness or whatever onto either recorded media of an audio or an audio video layer like videotape. They seem to have gained some energy at a bioplasmatic level. And I think you could argue, especially when you start studying what may have happened with Hedy Lamarr, I think that there's a direct parallel between how that translates over to people within the connection to magnetic tape and videotape, where there's a bioplasmatic connection via those hemoglobin iron oxide levels, how when people hear the voice of a person or see the image of a person and respond to it at an emotional level, how they bioplasmatically will resonate at those coiled levels, right? And that would be, I guess, partially your iron oxide levels and its interaction with things like the copper content in your bloodstream. Thinking it through, that these aren't antennas that have like your standard elements like you typically see on a cell tower. They're more of these coils that have a little bit of a randomness to it. They're patterned, I guess. I'm not a blood expert or a DNA expert, but when you think it through, you can kind of see that they're kind of coiled antennas that can pulse and resonate, right? So the manipulation of that, the same way that like you place a crystal inside technology and it oscillates at a set frequency to make it work, if they do that to people, they're also getting different people to sort of resonate at the same frequency, right? Just it's a little bit esoteric. I don't want to get too deep into that, but thinking through in terms of archaeometry, if all of the past blood that's been spilled into the soil, is just human ether extracted and returning to earth, and it's concentrating as a crystal and other forms of minerals like en route. In tandem, it's not just like the trauma from blood spill, it would also be the positive orgone radiation that's also experienced, right? And that would be through like loving expression or through sexual energy. It's also something that can bind etherically and into the crystalline formations, you see. So really everything that we're experiencing here, whether you accept that it's, a real thing or not, depending on your belief systems, it still has an organic material that's returning into this collective source, whatever you agree upon that is. So what we experience here is relevant. We can't make arguments to say that this is all just a 3D experience, because we're actually alchemically dealing with specific materials that are binding everything we're experiencing here to the soil and to the earth, right? Where it recirculates and then we re-experience it. And so I think you have to think about that in terms of why they do certain things involving potentially like ritual sacrifice at certain locations, why it's important for them to go to hilltops and mountains and perform, death rituals and ritual murders and things like that, because this is how they bind etheric energy via iron oxide, copper, and other things. And that's why they'll have high levels of concentration of these blood spilled in these areas, So I don't want to get too dark on this right now, but there's a positive aspect to that too, and that, similarly in these locations where there was trauma experienced, one would have to, understand that it could be reworked through positive orgone and positive orgone extraction in similar locations to change the dynamics there. That's my hypothesis. Whether or not that it's real, I don't know, but I think it's worth investigating. And at bare minimum, you have to accept that when we really think about what we should be placing our energies into and everything like that, I think that this is a concept to study as a science, as a research topic, and all the ways that it can be explored. In in a lot of different ranges. It's definitely worth looking into, just as an exercise of what's possible through positive intention, and I'm not trying to sound hokey or anything like here, or I don't know, I'm not trying to be contrived or anything, is all I'm saying. It's just that when we're thinking about what we should be placing our energies into and what we should be focusing on day to day, maybe this is a way to reverse some of the harm that's been done, is if we can identify locations where there's been trauma induced into the location, I guess you could even say like haunted locations or something like that, and try to reintroduce positive orgone spectrum energy into there. And if we're able to do measurable tests where we can see how, the different types of dormant energy electromagnetic fields change through anchoring positive orgone in areas that have typically had dark orgone, placed in them. I think that would be worth studying too. There's a lot of ways you can integrate paranormal research and things like that, because I do believe that there's a science to these things that are just merely hidden, or just too esoteric for the average person to understand without going through a great deal of time and dedicating a lot of their energies towards learning it. So, me personally, I kind of stumbled upon it through some of this, the concept of Hedy Lamarr, and thinking through about how spread spectrum plays into frequency hopping and the programming of water potentially, right? So, Hedy Lamarr invented with somebody else this concept of frequency hopping that's been introduced in the concept of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and CDMA technologies. And I worked with CDMA for years. It's code division multiple access technology. That was the core technology behind everything that I worked on. So one thing I've always known about is it had a lot of esoteric patterns. Even before I was even studying those things, it was inside the technology I was working in. So a lot of things that feed into that golden ratio, the 8 by 8 into 64, right? And you have this Walsh code that is part of the encryption, as part of the scrambling. That's 64 by 64 Walsh codes, again involving the random scrambling. And then they also have a concept involving CDMA technology, and that was called channel elements. They would divide up the traffic and distribute the data and the call traffic across different frequency carriers, right? So, and those would come in increments of 32, 64, 128, 192, tapping into, again, that 32, 64, 128, that same types of math. So you're getting into the same numbers again, and back to that golden ratio, And so I kept wondering, maybe just by virtue of being around these frequencies and patterned, modulation schemes of a very specific type, is it possible that just that interaction, trained my mind at a subconscious level to understand esoteric numerology? Because I just sort of understood it. It's just like one day I just had this awakening, and I started to understand very esoteric concepts involving numerology and math without understanding how I learned it. So I know there's a certain unknown element to understanding these things, because I don't believe that I was intelligent enough to just sort of understand it all. It just sort of happened, right? And so I think a lot of times when I was working with the technology, it was just really mimicking a human process, which is being influenced and bringing into manifestation the ability to make these technologies work, just because of the archaeometry involved with sacred and ancient math, And they've always practiced these certain types of numeric concepts that were patterns, right? Because if a person can get this many objects by this many objects, it was a simple way of doing math before you could write things down when you think about it. Really think about it. It was something you could visually place there before you could a person wouldn't even have to know what a number is. You could just show them, that's 8 blocks there. Now I need you to stack those, 8 and 8. All right, good. Now, see that many and that many? Now do that over there. Think about it. We didn't have blueprints. We didn't have computers. How were they developing all this, architecture? It was because they were introducing archaeometry in other ways, through symbolic communication, through shapes and symbols. And it's still happening today, just at a higher level and more in our subconscious. And so when you think about it, and thinking through what Professor Emoto discussed involving water frequencies, our body's 70% water. And I'll try to expand on this again in another material, because I don't want to do it in this one yet. But thinking in terms of Professor Emoto and like the positive aspects and the negative aspects, and how water's programmable. Our bodies are 70% water. Our water has a frequency. And so if you change that resonant frequency of your body's water, then again, you're starting to manipulate the interaction of those iron oxide levels and hemoglobin on a way, because, really the water's mixing with all these other things inside your body. So, yeah, I'll get into that in an upcoming material, more into Professor Emoto, spread spectrum, Hedy Lamarr, and CDMA, I think, because there's something to this whole notion of the way you program water cells through positive intention and negative intention, through the sound of your voice, what your intentions are in your words, and how that translates to programming at a frequency level, and through your hemoglobin and your iron oxide levels. Because I'm trying not to sound too foo-foo here with my talk. I mean, I want you to understand there's a science to this that I believe that we just need to understand better, and I'm not trying to speak at some sort of in some sort of new age construct here. So yeah, just thinking through about the DOR and POR spectrum involving the way our blood interacts at that iron oxide level, and those different things interacting with the soil, and it's just food for thought here, so that we can start getting the discussion going. So Anyways, thank you for your time, and we'll pick this up later.